It began with sermons, not bullets, not torches, not chains, just words, spoken slowly, repeated weekly in the cold stone chapel of St. Vern, nestled deep within rural France. An entire town began to change, not overnight, but gradually, quietly. Started with guilt, the kind that settles in your bones. Then came the fear, eternal fire, divine punishment, demons in disguise. The villagers did not question it, because the voice that told them these things wore the robe of God. His name was Father Etienne Cotton, a man of few expressions, but endless certainty. He claimed to see the invisible, to speak with angels, to sense evil hiding in ordinary faces. What began as devotion became obsession, then hysteria, then death. By the time the French authorities intervened in 1892, it was already too late. A church community of 300 had collapsed into a nightmare of confession, violence, and religious psychosis, all under the hypnotic reign of one man. This is not a parable. It is not myth. It is a forgotten chapter of real history, one erased by fear today. We bring it back into the light, not to glorify it, but to understand it, because dark psychology does not always wear a dictator's uniform. Sometimes it hides behind stained glass. Before we begin, I want to hear from you. If you lived in 1892, do you believe you would have obeyed Father Cotton or questioned him? Be honest, let me know in the comments. The village of St. Vern was not marked on most maps in 1892. It lay hidden in the folds of southern France, a place of misty mornings, cobbled silence, and narrow roads that coiled like sleeping snakes through the hills. Life moved slowly here. The world outside rarely disturbed the rhythm. Most homes were built from the same pale stone as the church. People lived and died within walking distance of where they were born. Faith was not a choice in St. Vern. It was the air. The priest's word was law. And before Father Etienne Cotton arrived, that law had been kind, simple, forgiving. Then, one summer, a change came. Father Paul, the elderly priest who had served for decades, suddenly vanished from the pulpit. No formal announcement, no funeral. Just gone. The bishop's office sent a replacement within the week. A younger man, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, and striking in presence. His name was Etienne Cotton. He claimed to come from the city. Some whispered that he had trained in Paris, others said Rome. But what made people remember him was not where he came from. It was how he made them feel. From his first sermon, he spoke like a man possessed by certainty. He did not deliver gentle parables. He issued warnings. The devil is not beneath us, he told them. He walks among you. He wears the face of your neighbor, your son, your wife, and only the vigilant shall be saved. At first, people were unsettled. His tone was cold. His eyes rarely blinked. But what he offered was clarity in an unclear world. That kind of certainty is seductive, especially when wrapped in sacred cloth. Within weeks, villagers began altering their routines. Some stopped drinking. Others began confessing minor sins. With tears and trembling, one woman claimed to see shadows in her room at night. Another accused her own brother of cursing her crops. Father Cotton welcomed every confession, not with punishment, but with long, whispered prayers. He touched no one. He punished no one. Yet, somehow, his presence alone made people kneel. In time, he changed the structure of the Mass. He extended confession hours to 3 times a week. He introduced what he called the hour of purification, a midnight gathering where the villagers would kneel in silence while he walked among them, muttering in Latin, placing his hand on heads at random. Those he touched often wept. No one dared question it. What the people did not understand was that this was not religion. It was psychological entrancement, a method perfected not in Rome, but in hidden corners of Europe where minds were broken before bones. Father Cotton had studied not only theology, he had studied mesmerism, suggestion, hypnosis. He had read the works of Franz Mesmer, James Braid, and Abbe Faria, and he had found a way to fuse science with spiritual terror. His voice, for instance, operated in rhythm, repetition, slowly delivered phrases that became mental hooks. Only the pure may see the light. Only the clean shall survive the fire. Only the obedient shall be saved. He never shouted. He never smiled. He simply repeated, over and over. The villagers began to repeat them too, first in whispers, then in conversation, then in their dreams. This was not devotion. This was reprogramming. One evening, a farmer named Marcel Bernard reported a strange vision. He claimed that during the hour of purification, he had seen a glowing figure in the chapel's rafters. When asked to describe it, he wept and refused. He then offered his entire week's earnings to the church in exchange for protection. Father Cotton said nothing. He simply placed a hand on Marcel's head and whispered, "The devil knows your face." That line spread through the village like wildfire. Children would repeat it in games. Wives would whisper it to drunk husbands. The devil knows your face. Fear had entered the bloodstream of St. Vern, and Father Cotton controlled the heartbeat. By autumn, he had divided the village into two groups. He did not say it openly, but it was clear. Those who attended all services were seated in the front pews, the chosen. Those who missed even one service were seated in the back, the damned. The damned were often whispered about, gossiped about. Some even reported seeing animals die on their land. Others claimed to feel watched. In truth, Father Cotton said nothing. To them, he did not need to. The villagers did it themselves. A woman named Lenny Renault, who missed two midnight services due to illness, found a burning cross etched on her barn door one morning. Her husband begged the priest for forgiveness. Cotton told him she must cleanse herself in the presence of the Lord. What followed was a public kneeling. Lenny, frail and shaking, was forced to crawl down the church aisle under the gaze of the entire town. She begged for forgiveness. Cotton said only, "We shall see." By now, the town was no longer a community. It was a theater of judgment. Neighbors spied on each other. Children informed on parents. Confessions became currency. And through it all, Father Cotton watched with hollow calm. But the true turning point came in the winter of 1892, when a boy died. His name was Luke Moreau, 12 years old, curious, playful. He had reportedly laughed during Mass, not mockingly, just innocently. But someone had noticed. Someone had told. 3 days later, he was found in the woods, frozen, alone, hands bound in rope. The village mourned, but not loudly. At the funeral, Father Cotton did not offer words of comfort. He said only one sentence: "Mock the Lord, and he shall mock your life." Gasps filled the church. A few families began to cry. Others stared straight ahead. No one spoke of murder. No one called the authorities. Because in St. Vern, by then, there was no law but the pulpit. Behind closed doors, whispers spread. Had Father Cotton ordered it? Had someone acted on his unspoken will? The truth, like Luke's body, remained cold and buried. But one thing was clear. Father Cotton no longer needed to command. He only needed to suggest. And the village would obey. It began with whispers. Inside the narrow confession booth of St. Vern's Chapel, Father Cotton sat for hours, longer than any priest should. He would not leave until every villager had entered, one by one, speaking their sins in the dark. But what began as repentance slowly became something else. The townspeople did not confess. They were made to. Father Cotton's questions were never gentle. He asked about private thoughts, about dreams, about secret grudges and forgotten lies. He asked them again and again, rephrased, twisted, until the villagers began to remember things that may never have happened at all. A young girl named Marian told the priest she had once stolen an apple from her neighbor's tree. By the time she left the booth, she believed she had cursed the orchard. The next morning, the trees were found burned. A man named Claude spoke of nightmares, dreams of animals with human voices. Father Cotton told him those were not dreams, but visions, signs that someone in the village had been touched by Lucifer. These people were not mad. They were simple, faithful, but they were also afraid. And fear, when repeated and confirmed, becomes belief. Father Cotton did not scream. He did not rage. His voice was calm, rhythmic, nearly tranquil, but there was a rhythm to it, a lulling repetition that made the mind vulnerable. This was not preaching. It was programming. The confessional became his laboratory. The booth was small, the walls padded slightly with thick red cloth. His voice did not echo. There was no sound but his, and inside that narrow box, something happened. To time, people stayed for minutes, but swore it felt like hours. Some said they forgot what day it was. Others left weeping, unable to remember what they had just said. Each session ended the same, with forgiveness. But forgiveness, in this chapel, came with a price. The penance Father Cotton assigned was not ordinary. He would ask a husband to fast for a week while sleeping outside in the cold. He ordered a mother to bury her dead chickens and plant roses over the graves. He instructed children to stare at a wooden cross and recite their sins until they cried. None of these acts were violent, but they were strange, ritualistic, and the people obeyed, because to disobey was to risk the soul. One woman, Elise, a widow of 32, confessed that she sometimes missed her husband not for his virtue, but for the way he made her feel safe. Cotton paused. Then he asked her if she had ever been touched by spirits in her sleep. She said yes, once long ago. That was all he needed. She was marked. The next day, her name was added to a list, a parchment only Father Cotton kept. He never showed it, but the town knew of it. The list of the watched. Those on the list were treated differently. They were asked to kneel longer, to fast more often. They were watched closely, not just by Cotton, but by others, their neighbors, their friends. It was as if the entire village had been recruited into a silent network of eyes, and no one spoke of it, not aloud. That was his genius. He had turned guilt into currency. The more one suffered, the more one proved devotion. Pain became sacred. Silence became survival. One evening, during a candlelit sermon, Father Cotton introduced a new ritual, the Circle of Light. Each Friday night, select members of the congregation would gather behind the church in a fenced garden with a single stone statue of St. Michael. They would stand in a circle, holding candles, and confess not to the priest, but to each other. These sessions were brief, intense, and always ended with Father Cotton placing a hand on each forehead, whispering prayers in Latin. No one understood the words, but they all said the same thing afterward. They felt lighter. That was the trap. Every pain released made them more dependent, each ritual more addictive. Eventually, people began to volunteer for penance. A farmer named Henry began sleeping on nails. A seamstress stitched verses of punishment into her dresses. Children were seen drawing crosses into the dirt with their fingers over and over. By spring of 1892, the village had changed, not just in behavior, but in expression. Their eyes no longer wandered. They stared straight ahead. Their mouths rarely smiled. Their voices dropped into low, respectful tones. Even laughter sounded like a sin. And still, they came to confess. There was no resistance, only routine. And in that routine, Father Cotton flourished. But his reach went further than the chapel. He began visiting homes. He said it was to bless the sick, but his visits were long, private, and always ended with instructions. One woman was told to burn her books. A man was asked to remove all mirrors from his home. A girl was forbidden to speak to her grandmother, for she had once read tarot cards. Every visit left behind a seed of isolation. That was the next step, control through separation. The villagers were slowly disconnected from anything that could anchor them: family, memory, tradition. Father Cotton became their single source of truth, their only compass, and still, no one resisted. Until the boy, his name was Pierre, 12 years old, son of a carpenter. Pierre had heard the sermons, attended the rituals, even confessed twice. But something in him resisted. He asked questions. He spoke during Mass. He laughed when others cried. Father Cotton noticed. At first, he called Pierre spirited, then disobedient, then dangerous. One evening, Pierre was brought to the confessional, not by choice, by force. Two men, both elders of the church, escorted him there. What was said inside the booth that night remains unknown. But the next morning, Pierre was gone. His parents said he had run away. Others whispered he had been taken. Father Cotton said nothing. He simply led a prayer for protection. The town mourned, but it did not ask questions, because by then, questions were treason. The absence of Pierre marked a turning point. The rituals grew darker, the sermons longer, the penance more brutal, and through it all, the confessional never closed. Father Cotton sat inside, day after day, waiting, listening. instructing, rewriting the minds of a village, one whispered secret at a time. He did not need soldiers. He had guilt. He did not need chains. He had belief. And above all, he had silence. Because in St. Vern, silence was the loudest sound of all. By late summer, the town of St. Vern no longer felt like a place. It felt like a state of mind. The people walked the streets as if underwater, slow, quiet, deliberate. There were no songs from windows, no laughter from the fields. Even the dogs barked less. Something unseen had pressed its hand against the village. And under that pressure, things began to change. The rituals deepened. The circle of light became larger. Men, women, even children stood in that garden behind the church every Friday, holding candles with trembling hands. The confessions no longer involved only sins of action. They now included thoughts. A mother confessed that she had once wished her husband would die. A baker whispered that he sometimes imagined himself setting fire to his own shop. Father Cotton never punished these thoughts. He praised the courage to speak them. And then he asked questions. Did the thought come alone? Did it feel like a whisper? Was it your voice, or something darker? Innocent people began to doubt their minds. They began to believe their thoughts were not their own, that something had entered them, that the devil had planted seeds in their hearts. This fear, this belief in a corrupt interior, created a sickness of the soul, a mass affliction with no blood, no fever, yet contagious beyond reason. And then came the idea, not from Father Cotton directly, but from one of his watchers, the select group of men and women who stood closest during his sermons, who helped conduct the rituals, who were said to hear his private thoughts. They spoke in code, in references. The devil walks among us. Sin has taken shape. It wears a face. It hides in plain sight. These were not metaphors. They were warnings, or rather, instructions. For weeks, no one acted, but the seed was planted. And when fear becomes fertile, even the smallest lie can bloom into a crime. The turning point came in September. A man named Baptiste, 64 years old, a retired teacher, was seen walking near the forest edge at dusk. He was humming, not a hymn, but an old folk tune, one that the church had quietly discouraged for its pagan roots. The next day, rumors spread that Baptiste had spoken ill of the circle of light, that he had told his neighbor the candles were for show, that Father Cotton was just a man. No one confronted Baptiste. Instead, they prayed harder. They confessed more. They watched. And one night, as the village gathered once again in the garden behind the chapel, Father Cotton said something different. He did not begin with scripture. He began with silence. He stood before the circle, hands clasped, eyes closed, and waited. For almost 5 full minutes, no one spoke, not even the wind. Then he opened his eyes and said, "There's a rot among us." That was all, and yet, it was everything. The next morning, the villagers found Baptiste's home empty. The door open, the fire still burning, his bed untouched. Some said he left. Others said he was taken. No one searched. Instead, the village gathered at the chapel, and for the first time, they did not sit. They knelt. All of them, even the elders, even the watchers. Father Cotton led a prayer not for Baptiste, but for protection, from the unnamed, from the dark. It was the beginning of the purge. Over the next 2 weeks, more names were whispered. Elise, the widow who had once cried too long. During penance, Margot, a seamstress who read in candlelight instead of sunlight. Gerard, a farmer who missed 3 Friday rituals. One by one, they vanished. No bodies, no blood, only absence. The town said nothing, but it knew, because the disappearances were not random. They were surgical. They followed a pattern. Each person had, at some point, questioned something, expressed doubt, shown hesitation. And Father Cotton never needed to accuse. He simply spoke of vigilance, of testing faith, of cutting away diseased branches so the tree could grow strong. The people did the rest. The watchers became more active. They visited homes. They asked questions. How often do you pray? Do you dream? What do you see when you dream? Do you ever wake up afraid? These were not questions of concern. They were traps. Once asked, there was no right answer, because even silence could be interpreted. Soon, the town began to police itself. Neighbors reported neighbors. Children told on their parents. Husbands turned on wives. It was not loyalty. It was fear. Fear of being next. And then came the first public act. It was cold that night. October's breath had begun to bite the leaves. The chapel was full, but the garden behind it was fuller. Over 70 villagers stood in the circle of light. This time, Father Cotton entered last. He wore white, not black. A robe stitched with strange symbols, not letters, but shapes, curved like thorns. In his hands, he held something wrapped in cloth. He walked to the center of the circle and unwrapped it. Inside was a wooden mask, crude, carved, darkened by soot. He held it up, and he said, "Evil has worn our faces. It is time we wear it." Then he placed the mask on a boy, 15 years old, thin, pale. The villagers knew him as Lucien. Lucien had been caught writing something during Mass. A drawing. Father Cotton said it was not a drawing. It was a map of thought. A door for spirits. Lucien did not speak. He did not resist. They placed him on his knees. And then, one by one, the watchers stepped forward, each with a small branch. Each dipped the branch in a bowl of red water, a mixture of wine, ash, and crushed berries. They marked his forehead. Not with crosses, with symbols. After the last one, Father Cotton bent down and whispered something in Lucien's ear. And the boy screamed. It was not a scream of pain. It was a scream of fear. He looked up and shouted, "He sees me." Then he fell silent. No one moved. No one helped. And when the boy finally stood, his face was pale, his mouth open, but no sound came out. He walked away alone into the forest. The village never saw him again. The next day, Father Cotton delivered a sermon. He spoke of cleansing, of triumph over darkness, of sacrifice. And then, for the first time, he smiled. It was a small smile, but it changed everything, because it was not the smile of a man at peace. It was the smile of a man who had tested a boundary and found no resistance. A line had been crossed, bloodless, but not innocent. The town was no longer merely obedient. It was complicit. It had tasted the ritual. It had felt the thrill of exile, the strange comfort of unity through blame, and it wanted more. The puppet master had not just taken control. He had made them need it. And in that garden, under candlelight, the final transformation began. St. Vern was no longer a town. It was a theater. And the next act would demand real blood. Winter arrived early in St. Vern. The winds swept in before the snow, dry and slicing, like invisible blades cutting through the narrow alleys and stone walls. The air smelled sharper, like something was waiting just beyond the trees. It was not just the weather that had changed. It was the atmosphere of the entire village. A thick silence now lived in the corners of homes, in the spaces between conversations, and in the eyes of those who once spoke freely. St. Vern no longer felt like a place where people lived. It felt like a place suspended between a dream and a warning. Father Cotton still stood at the pulpit each week, but his tone had shifted. His voice no longer carried the warmth of spiritual guidance. Now it carried the weight of judgment. He no longer spoke about mercy or grace or the healing power of faith. He spoke of divine rage. He preached that God was not only a creator of light, but a fire that punished those who strayed from his truth. The fire, he said, did not burn to destroy, it burned to protect. And if the fire must take a few in order to save the many, then so be it. The villagers listened with unwavering attention. They no longer asked questions. They did not whisper doubts. Lucien's disappearance had taught them what happens when someone is marked. His scream on that night still echoed in their memory, but so did the peace that followed. No more resistance, no more unrest. It was as if a sickness had been extracted from the body of the village. That was the unspoken lesson. Remove the disturbance, and harmony returns. But peace, once achieved through sacrifice, becomes addictive. When killing solves one problem, people begin to see problems in everything. The next name was Iseline. She was 16 years old, a quiet girl who worked at the village bakery and took care of her little brother. After their parents died from illness, she never spoke out of turn, never missed a sermon, and always greeted others with kindness. No one had ever feared her. But one evening, A watcher reported that Iselin had draped a sheet over the mirror in her house. When asked why, she simply replied that she felt watched when she looked into it. That was enough. The watchers brought the information to Father Cotton. During his next sermon, he did not mention Iselin by name. Instead, he spoke of mirrors, how they were not merely glass but portals through which eyes could look in. He warned the village that the devil could hide in reflections, and that some people unknowingly invited those eyes into their homes. He ended the sermon with a quiet, ominous prayer for those who might already be touched. 2 nights later, a mark appeared on Iselin's front door. It was not a symbol anyone recognized, but it was painted in red, and that was enough. No one spoke to her, no one offered comfort. Even in the chapel, where she knelt in her usual place, no one sat near her. Her smile was returned with empty stares. The town had already decided. After one particular sermon, as the crowd stood to leave, Father Cotton remained seated. His voice was soft but clear when he said her name, Iselin. Stay. She froze in place. Her back stiffened, but she turned slowly and obeyed. The chapel emptied around her. No one offered to stay behind. No one asked why she was called. They simply left. That night was the last time anyone saw her. The watchers claimed she had gone to live with distant family. A few repeated the story. Most said nothing. But everyone knew. The silence around her absence was not confusion, it was agreement. The town now understood something that would shape their fate forever. You could disappear without making a mistake. All it took was a single sign, a single suspicion. And once that suspicion passed through Father Cotton's hands, it became judgment. After Iselin vanished, the villagers grew more disciplined. They confessed more. They smiled more. They knelt longer during prayer. They watched each other for signs of doubt or difference. Children were taught new customs. Never speak to yourself. Never draw pictures. Never stare into water or mirrors. A new language of fear began to shape daily life. Father Cotton introduced new rituals. On Fridays, the entire village fasted in silence from sunrise to sunset. No food, no words, only reflection. On Sundays, he led the congregation in a strange chant, a series of guttural syllables in no known language. He told them it was a shield. They believed him, even as they felt uneasy reciting it. Then, in the heart of December, the illusion shattered completely. A man named Pierre, who lived on the village's edge, failed to appear at sermons for 3 consecutive weeks. He was a quiet candle maker who walked with a limp and kept mostly to himself. Though he was not close with many, he was never feared. He read old books and gave wax figurines to children. His absence was unusual, but not alarming at first. However, a watcher was sent to check on him. They found his home unlocked. A candle was still burning on the table. Untouched food sat on a plate, and the air inside felt still and cold. There was no sign of struggle, just absence. Later that afternoon, a group of wood-gatherers stumbled upon a body near the forest's edge. The snow had half covered it, but the blood left a trail that was unmistakable. It was Pierre. His body was stiff and face down. His throat had been cut multiple times, not with precision, but with urgency, almost as if the killer had acted in panic or fury. The village gathered around his body in silence. No one wailed. No one asked what had happened. All eyes turned to Father Cotton. He stepped forward and placed his hand upon Pierre's back. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them with an eerie calm. He said only one thing: the devil took him. But not before we stopped it. No more explanation was given. No police were contacted. No burial was arranged by family. Instead, a village-wide vigil was held, not for Pierre, but for St. Vern itself. They lit candles, chanted in the unknown tongue, and thanked God for purifying the land once more. Something had changed forever. The town had accepted a killing. They did not consider it murder. They believed it was a cleansing. From that moment, no further justification would be required. If someone was removed, it must have been necessary. And so, the watchers no longer crept in shadows. They walked openly, carrying staffs carved with symbols. They inspected homes without knocking. They stood behind people in the chapel and whispered prayers over them. The people stopped asking why. They started asking who. Who was next? Who must be taken so that we may stay safe? Father Cotton grew more powerful. His voice, once careful, now thundered across the chapel walls. He told them, the blood on the snow was unfortunate but necessary. He said evil could only be stopped when it is named and cast out, and when it hides too well, it must be dragged out with fire. Some said he wept after Pierre was found. Others claimed he smiled. But one thing was certain that night, the chapel smelled different. It no longer smelled of wood or incense, it smelled like iron, the smell of blood. The watchers now believed they were chosen. They began making lists. They began placing quiet marks on homes days in advance. And the people, desperate to avoid suspicion, began confessing things they had never done. One woman admitted she once envied her neighbor's son. A young boy said he dreamed of shadows shaped like a woman. A man confessed that during one sermon, he had silently laughed at a thought. Father Cotton never raised his voice. He never accused. He would simply respond with a phrase now burned into the village's soul. Let us pray. Let us watch. Let us wait. The village was no longer a community. It had become a test. Each sunrise brought a new question. Who would disappear? Next, and even more terrifying, no one asked whether the purge was wrong. They only asked if it was enough. Would one more sacrifice bring peace? Would one more cleansing quiet the evil? The rituals had turned to law. The law had turned into worship. And the faith once placed in God now belonged fully to one man, Father Cotton. A man who had replaced God in the hearts of a terrified town. And when a man replaces God, the rules of morality no longer apply. Only his will does. What happens when a man controls not just the actions of people but their thoughts, their fears, and their understanding of right and wrong? We are about to find out. The first thaw of spring came with no birdsong. St. Vern was quiet, not peaceful, only still, the kind of stillness found in graveyards, the kind of silence that feels chosen, not natural. Snow melted slowly round the chapel, revealing patches of earth that looked bruised. The watchers now moved without hesitation. They no longer waited for signs. They created them. They decided who looked strange, who behaved differently, who prayed without conviction. It did not take much, a yawn, a crooked smile, a question asked at the wrong time. That was enough. And so the list of the condemned grew longer, and Father Cotton approved each name without needing to read them. He trusted the pattern. He trusted the rhythm of fear. But something shifted one Sunday. Her name was Thuries, a widow in her 50s, known to be devout, but quiet. She baked bread for the orphans. She had buried 2 sons in 2 different winters. She had never missed a sermon, until that day. She arrived late. She entered with no apology. Her shawl was crooked, her eyes wild. She walked past the pews and stood directly before Father Cotton. The entire chapel turned to look. The watchers stepped forward, hands on their staffs. But Cotton raised his hand. Let her speak. Thuries did not speak at first. Her lips trembled, but she forced herself to stand still. And then she said only this: "You are not God." A wave of tension rolled through the room. She looked at the people. "You fear the devil," she said, "but you do not see where he truly stands. You pray louder, but you love less. You chant strange words, but you forget his name." Her voice cracked, not with fear, but fatigue. "You have become afraid of your own shadow, and you made that fear into a man. You gave it a robe. You gave it a chapel. You gave it a throne. And now you bow." A watcher moved forward. Cotton nodded slightly. The man paused, confused. Then Cotton smiled. Let her finish. Thuries looked into his eyes. "You are not God," she whispered again. "You are just a man who learned how to hide behind him." No one spoke. No one moved. She turned and walked out of the chapel. She was not seen again. But that night, for the first time in months, no house was marked. No one was taken. The watchers remained inside. The village did not chant. Something was breaking. Not loudly, but like a thread pulled from the edge of a shroud. Whispers began, tiny doubts. A woman told her husband she felt strange repeating words she did not understand. A boy said he dreamed of Iselin. A man said he heard laughter in the forest, and it sounded like Pierre. Father Cotton tried to regain control. His sermons grew louder. his eyes sharper. He introduced new punishments, hours of silence, fasts that lasted days, sleep deprivation. But it did not work. Something inside the villagers had begun to wake. The turning point came when a child barely 9 was accused of keeping a secret. A watcher had seen him hiding something under a floorboard. They broke the board. It was a drawing, a picture of his mother and sister, smiling, with birds in the sky, when Cotton ordered him taken. Something snapped. The boy's mother screamed. Then, 2 men stepped forward. They placed themselves between the watchers and the child. One of them spoke. No more. The chapel froze. Cotton stepped down from his pulpit. He looked at them carefully. Do you deny the truth? One of the men answered, we deny your version of it. And suddenly, like the crack of a frozen lake, everything shifted. Other villagers stood. A woman removed the red mark from her door with a cloth. A watcher dropped his staff. Someone opened the chapel door wide, letting in the cold, honest air. Father Cotton tried to speak, but the words came out hollow. He tried to command, but his voice was just a voice now, not a spell. He tried to pray, but no one echoed him. The villagers did not arrest him. They did not exile him. They simply walked away, one by one, as if leaving a play that had gone on too long. They went back to their homes, their true homes, not cages. And Father Cotton, he remained in the chapel. Alone. Days passed, then weeks. Someone went to check on him once. He was gone. No note, no fire, no sign of a struggle, only a robe folded neatly across the altar, and beneath it a mirror, cracked down the center. The town of St. Vern never spoke openly of those months again, but it remembered, in the trees that grew unevenly, in the silence that fell before storms, in the children who were taught to question, gently but persistently. And Father Cotton became a name not spoken, only known, a memory not honored, but not erased either, because what he built was not done with poison or spells. It was built with something far more dangerous. Trust, fear, and blind faith. The story of St. Vern is not just a warning about cults or charlatans. It is about the slow boil of compliance, the quiet erosion of doubt, the terrifying power of a lie repeated by a kind face. And so we leave you with this question. If someone like Father Cotton stood before you today, not in robes, not in Latin, but in modern words and smiling eyes, would you recognize the control, or would you call it comfort? Tell us in the comments. What would you do? Would you walk away, or would you bow? Let us know. We are watching.